and the rest of the Labor team. I'm very lucky to say that I was brought up in this area, and even lucky to say that I still live here, but now with my own young family. But that makes me very passionate about getting the best outcomes for our community here in Hasluck. And Federal Labor stands ready, united and stable to deliver those better outcomes for our community here in Hasluck. Federal Labor has a long list of commitments for our community, and in healthcare alone, Catherine King and I were here at this hospital only weeks ago announcing funding commitments for mental health. And Bill Shorten and I have been up to Kalamunda Hospital for funding commitments up there for our Hills Hospital. And even twice before, Bill, we've been here at this hospital announcing significant funding for various projects here in our community. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Bill Shorten back again for the third time, even just at this hospital, to make another important healthcare announcement. Bill.
Thanks, James. Good morning, everybody. I'm really pleased to be back at this hospital. But I'm even more pleased to be making an exciting announcement. If Labor is elected, we will provide $20 million to help with more clinical trials and make them available to people diagnosed with blood cancers and leukemia. Leukemia shouldn't be a death sentence. But if you can't access a trial, then potentially the inability to access that trial becomes a death sentence. 6,700 of our fellow Australians will die this year due to blood cancers. This $20 million is so important to assist. I have a very good friend who passed a couple of years ago. I miss him. He died of leukemia. For years he fought it. I don't want to see other people die when we could have prevented it. That's why this is such an important announcement. $20 million to help people in the fight of their lives, access to more treatment. This will save lives. I'd now like to hand over to Catherine King to talk more about this great announcement and how we're going to help close the gap in healthcare between the West and the East.
Thanks. Look, it's terrific to be here at Midland Hospital yet again with Bill, with Chris, with Hannah, with James, with Kim and with Madeline, our fantastic Labor team over here in the West. Well, blood cancers are one of the second most diagnosed cancers, and they include leukemias, myeloma and lymphoma. They are a very significant burden on our health system, but more importantly for patients who are diagnosed with these blood cancers, particularly if they don't get access to clinical trials after all other standard therapies haven't worked, it is really very much a death sentence. We've worked very closely with the Leukemia Foundation on this $20 million program for improvement in access to clinical trials. The Leukemia Foundation has worked with the Garvan Institute, and this will mean that Australians who have exhausted all other options for access for treatment for leukemia will get access to clinical trials through the Leukemia Foundation's Right to Trial program. 47 people a day are diagnosed with blood cancers, 47 of our fellow Australians, and this will go a long way to improving their care. To also bridge the gap between the East and West in terms of health services, today we've also announced further information about our cancer package. 2 new radiation therapy centres in Geraldton, in Albany, 10 cancer nurses in prostate, lung, metastatic cancer across the community here in Western Australia, and Camp Quality in Kalgoorlie, a fantastic organisation ensuring that children, when they go home from an acute episode in hospitals, back into their community are well looked after. We've also announced a further telestroke network, which we announced already. We did the national announcement here in Western Australia, but we've announced a further telestroke network for Geraldton today. Again, this is all part of Labor's commitment to Western Australia to really make sure that we bridge that gap between the East and the West when it comes to healthcare.
Thanks very much, Bill. Of course, as well as today's important announcements, later on today we will see the pre-election fiscal outlook. Coming so close after the budget, you would expect it to confirm what we knew from the budget. That is, that almost a quarter of the coming surplus is based on spending less on Australians with a disability. The government says there's not enough demand, which is an insult to every Australian with a disability. We also know that it will confirm that to pay for their never tax cuts, the government will have to engage in spending cuts of $40 billion a year over the medium term, $40 billion a year. Now, the government wants to have lots of discussions about tax cuts. That's fine. We're happy to have that discussion. They're delivering tax cuts which give a millionaire a tax cut of $40,000 a year and give a millionaire a tax cut of somewhere around $11,000 a year and give somebody earning $40,000 a year a tax cut of $11 a week. That's their plan for Australia. But they'll also have to make deep cuts to pay for it. They'll have to make deep cuts to health, to education. If they want to have the debate about tax cuts, they've got to fess up what are the spending cuts to pay for it. We know they've got form. They promised no cuts to health, education, the pension, the SBS or the ABC in 2013, and then they delivered all of the above. All of the above. Now, we'll deliver bigger tax cuts for Australians this year earning less than $48,000. We know that they can be afforded, but we're not going to sign up for these never tax cuts, which will be paid for by cuts. Liberals cut. They cut health, they cut education, and they've cut the pension when they've had the ability to do so. They should have the moral fortitude to fess up as to what the cuts are, then we'll have a proper budget debate. So, of course, the economy will be front and centre in this election. We relish that. We have alternative plans for the economy and for the budget, and we invite the government to be truthful with the Australian people about what their cuts are.
And I also just forgot to mention, we've got Bill Petch here from the Leukemia Foundation, who'd like to say a little bit about our commitment today of $20 million to improve the care for people with blood cancers. Bill.
Thank you, Catherine. The Leukemia Foundation absolutely supports today's announcement. It's a very significant step forward in creating access and equity of access to new and emerging therapies for people with blood cancer. These are therapies that they wouldn't normally be able to get access to and be available to them, but this is such an important step forward to survivability for people with blood cancer. It's the second most diagnosed cancer in this country, and it's the second biggest cause of cancer death in this country. So when you fail standard treatments, clinical trials are really your only option. But when 1 in 5 patients don't get access to clinical trials, and when less than 40% of patients get access to genomic screening, that becomes a problem. So the Right to Trial program is an absolute lifesaver for a whole lot of people, and we're absolutely pleased to be able to support this initiative today. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Well said. All right, well, good morning, everyone. There's a lot of you, and we're keen to have all the questions we can do. I might just start on my left, and then we'll work around and see if everyone can get a crack.
Sure. Mr. Shorten, yesterday when you said that you had no intention of increasing taxes on superannuation, were you not including already proposed Labor policies of up to $34 billion worth of changes to super savings? Were you just saying that there wouldn't be any new ones, or did you forget about that policy?
Okay, well, thanks for that, and I should also give a shout out to James who asked the question yesterday. I thought I was being asked about have we got any unannounced changes to superannuation, and we've already made the announcements of the changes we're going to make. But obviously we have changes which we outlined 3 years ago, and of course, so it should have picked the words better, no question. We have no proposals other than what we've already announced previously. No changes to the general taxation treatment other than what we've announced recently. Just to remind people, we have said that we will lower the concessional contribution cap from $250,000 income to $200,000. We've also said that we will change the non-concessional contribution caps to $75,000. So we've made some announcements, but I also have to say I notice that the government's reverted to type with their, lying about our policies. When you close down concessions and loopholes, this is not some massive increase in taxation. We're just saying that we think that these resources can be used better. And of course, when it comes to helping people contribute to their superannuation, we're not going to be lectured by a government who, with no mandate and no notice, changed the rules for amounts higher than $1.6 million. They made retrospective changes, which we oppose the retrospective nature of those changes. Also, we're not going to be lectured by a government who's frozen superannuation contributions, the compulsory contribution, at 9.5%. That has been such a disaster for low-paid people and for middle-class people in this country. It's just real economic vandalism. So I might just give James just because he was talking.
So I'd just like to clarify that compulsory, the employer contribution. Will you increase that? It is at 9% currently. Will you increase it? And what would you say to Bradley's report that would hurt low-income Australians?
Grattan Institute, they've been very busy, and we'd like to talk a bit about some of their reports, not just your one, but on your specific answer, it's at 9.5% now, and I'll ask Chris to supplement.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bill. I will answer that, and I'd just like to add on the general issue as well. We will get the superannuation guarantee to 12% on the existing legislated timetable. That's the difference between us and the government and the Liberals. The Liberals always find an excuse to delay increasing the superannuation guarantee. They promised in 1996 to keep the increases, and they reneged on the promise. They promised to continue increases in 2013. They've reneged on the promise. And if you add up all those delays, an Australian today is now retiring with $100,000 less in their superannuation. So that's what Liberals do. The superannuation guarantee increase is running about 23 years late, and every day of that delay is down to the Liberal Party. Every day of it. And as Bill said, just on the broader issue, Scott Morrison seems to want a pat on the back for saying no changes to superannuation over the next 3 years. Well, that's what Tony Abbott said in 2013, and during that term, Scott Morrison, as Treasurer, brought down a retrospective tax change. He said it wasn't retrospective. Well, the giveaway was in the effective date, 2007, which applied in 2016, the $1.6 million cap. So Scott Morrison wants to be very careful in his claims about superannuation. The other person who needs to be careful in his claims about superannuation is the Treasurer. Now, the Treasurer's been very active in the last 24 hours looking at the Labor Party's website. He appears to have nothing better to do. Good luck to him. I've had a look at the Liberal Party website. The Liberal Party has got 4 election policies they've got on their website. Congratulations, they've got 4 of them up. But that's okay. They've got a Liberal plan on their website. Trouble is, if you click on the plan, Safari could not open because the page is down. It's terrible when that happens, isn't it, Josh? Their Liberal Party plan is not active on their website. Before they start casting aspersions around, they might want to get their house in order. Their Liberal Party website plan is broken, just like the plan itself. The website is down. The plan is not active. It has been wiped. So before Josh wants to get tweeting, maybe just like your policies, get your policies right, get your website right first, Josh, as well.
Sorry, Mr. Bowen, just on the Grattan Institute warning that an increase to the compulsory super guarantee to employers would hurt low-income workers.
Well, I make this point. We have low wages growth in Australia under this government, and Bill is the only leader putting it on the agenda. Whether it be the living wage, whether it be reversing the penalty rate cuts, whether it be cracking down on sham contractors, Bill Shorten's the alternative Prime Minister putting wages on the agenda. Now, on the superannuation guarantee, it actually may be one of the ways, and is one of the ways, we can actually improve the share of the economy going to workers over time, putting the miracle of compound interest to work for them through superannuation. That's what the SG does. Now, some people will oppose superannuation increases just like they opposed it being introduced, just like the Liberal Party opposed it being introduced in the first place and said superannuation would be a disaster. It's one of Labor's great achievements. We're very proud of it, and only Labor will defend it. And the other point I'll make is, of course, that we have, as well as the policies Bill outlined policies to improve superannuation for women. It is not conscionable that so many women in Australia are retiring into poverty, having committed no crime but worked hard all their life. We want to pay the superannuation guarantee during paid parental leave, and we want to crack down on superannuation theft. And that's what it is. Employers, some bad employers, stealing from their employees. We've all seen too much of it as local members. We know this is a big problem. The Liberals ignore it. We'll make superannuation a national employment standard so that they can be pursued through the courts, because employers who don't pay superannuation are stealing from their employees, and they're also getting an unfair advantage over their competitors who are doing the right thing.
Just on the website, Mr. Bowen.
Sorry, Timmy, we'll try and go that way because he's still
going to leap around topic-wise a bit here. But
yes, well, that's just
Mr. Short,
you're next.
You've referenced ANU modelling today, which shows that your emissions reductions target would cost the same as the government's. How will it cost the same as the government's, considering you have a much bigger target? How will it cost the same?
Because we are costing our 45% reduction with international offsets. So, in fact, it does cost the same. The government's 26% doesn't have that.
Mr. Short.
But just further on climate change. We've given hundreds of talks about our policy on climate change, and we think it is an important issue in this election. So we can, you're referring quite accurately to the McKibben modelling, but there's other costs which we should recognise. Inaction on climate change is going to cost Australians in the future. Just ask the Property Council, just ask the Insurance Council. Just look at the increase in extreme weather events. Just look at the number of weather records which are being broken on a constant basis. You know, our natural disasters cost us in 12 months $18 billion. Now, we can't turn all of that around overnight with a policy, but we want to be a government who hands on a better deal to our kids on climate change. The other cost of inaction is, of course, rising energy prices. Single biggest contributor to rising energy prices is a lack of a climate and energy policy in this country. The current government's onto their 13th energy policy and their 3rd Prime Minister. You know, this isn't good enough. We're seeing a rise in prices because we're not creating policy certainty, because therefore the generation was not being invested in.
Mr. Shorten, the question on superannuation yesterday was very clear. It's hard to believe that you misunderstood it. You could easily have specified that you only meant you would add no more policies on top of the ones already announced. Does it not look dishonest, like you're trying to hide something when you don't mention that?
Obviously, going back and reading it and rereading what James asked me, you're right. I was answering a question which I thought I'd been asked, and I accept that it was a different question asked. But you're all formidable journalists. You know that our policies have been out there for 3 years. I'm sure you're all probably aware of them. And of course, today's been an opportunity to remind people of them.
You have an opportunity today to clear the record and to be upfront with the Australian people about how much you will raise off raising taxes on superannuation. How much?
Well, I don't accept your characterisation as raising taxes. When you wind back a concession, that's stopping a tax expenditure, which is not raising it. But let's be very clear. We're not going to take a lecture from the government. Our policies are out there for people to see. But we're not going to take a lecture from the government who retrospectively ambushed people in superannuation with their holdings by creating a retrospective timetable for them to pay more taxes. And also, one of the great shames of this government is that for the last number of years, mandatory minimum contributions have been stuck at 9.5%.
How much revenue?
How much extra revenue?
And do you dispute the government's figure of $34 billion over a decade?
I'll get Chris to supplement this, but I do dispute the characterisation as a tax increase. I absolutely do. What happens when you give a concession to someone is that's a tax expenditure. If I was to give you a concession on something, that is money we take out of the tax system, which you get. That is a concession to you. And that therefore becomes a choice. Is it the best use of a concession to give someone a concession, preferential treatment on one aspect of superannuation, or to invest in other parts of our nation's priorities? I'll get Chris to answer.
Yeah, thanks. Of course, Jim Chalmers and I will be releasing the budget bottom line and impact of all our decisions very shortly, now that we have the pre-election economic forecast. We'll be doing that over the course of the campaign. The Parliamentary Budget Office updates all our costings on a regular basis after every economic statement. But the superannuation tax concession reforms and winding into those reforms and reversal of some of the government's measures, which our analysis shows are regressive, benefiting high-income earners and high-wealth individuals primarily, does return to the budget $30 billion over the medium term on the current projections.
All right, next.
Mr. Shorten, opposed to superannuation taxation, income tax. The government is going to the election with tax cuts aimed at people on 90 to 120,000 in 2022. They are not high income earners. If you live in Sydney, you live in Perth, that is not a high income. What do you say to those people that under your present plan you are not offering anything else?
Well, first of all, this government's going with proposed tax cuts, which means you have to vote in at least 2 elections. By 2022, we think this government is making up these tax cuts, or in other words, they can't pay for them. The question which this government hasn't yet answered is, how do they pay for these? See, once you take this tax income out of the budget, you've got to replace it. There's only 2 or 3 ways you do it. By raising more taxes somewhere else, by paying more interest on the national debt, which has doubled under the Liberals, or cutting services. And this is why the Grattan Institute, who was quoted earlier in another matter, they've released a report which shows that this government has got secret cuts which will involve tens of billions of dollars of cuts to services. So we think these tax cuts the government have promised are a mirage. We certainly agree with the government on the first round of tax cuts. In fact, we've got better tax cuts for 3.6 million people under $40,000. But this government cannot explain its mirage of tax cuts in the future, on the never-never, unless they explain what they're going to cut in the way of services. And it's a matter of choices. I'm not going to make a promise about tax cuts which are a mirage, which this government hasn't explained how they pay for them. I think Australians want to see the detail, and that's what we're doing with our plans and our proposals. I mean, for example, for me the killer number which shows this government's either radically out of touch or just lying to the people of Australia is that under Mr Morrison's tax plan for Australians, if you're a millionaire, you'll get a tax cut under Mr Morrison of $11,000. But if you're a person on $40,000, Mr Morrison only wants to give you $11 a week. It just shows you his priorities and who he's backing in. And the only way he can pull off this stunt of giving millionaires $11,000 in tax refund and people on $40,000 $11 a week is by taking the axe to health and education services. And as we've seen today, I just think health is more important than giving a millionaire an $11,000 tax cut.
You ruled out any further changes to superannuation taxes.
But let's be really clear, other than what we've already announced. Can be a slow learner, but I still learn.
What about any changes to superannuation arrangements to stop accounts being eaten up by fees and exorbitant charges and that sort of thing?
One of the important things, just to answer that as well, that Bill pioneered when he was Superannuation Minister is the concept of the Council of Superannuation Custodians, which we will implement in office, which is to take superannuation out of the budget cycle, to have a transparent approach to change to superannuation every 5 years, which we have said remains our approach in government, and that was Bill's idea when we were in government. It hasn't been implemented because we haven't been in office for the last 6 years, but it's a good idea because people are right to say they want more certainty for superannuation, and only Labor will deliver the Council of Superannuation Custodians. In relation to the other matters, fees and non-performing funds, for example, I'd refer you to speeches that I've made and that Claire O'Neill is making, I think, as late as today, on Labor's general approach. To be fair to both the government and the opposition, we have both said we will take our time to work through the Productivity Commission review. We said we're not attracted to the best in show model, but it's a substantial report. I've said, for example, that no underperforming fund will have a friend in Bill Shorten or Chris Bowen, and I don't care if they're a retail fund or an industry fund. They will have no friends in a Labor government. They will need to lift their performance or get out. Now, of course, we'll work through with Treasury advice the best ways of implementing that approach, and of course we want to put downward pressure on fees, as we did when Bill and I were respectively superannuation ministers with My Super, and those reforms, and there's more to do. We've said that just a small reduction in fees over a working life massively changes somebody's retirement balance when they retire, and we remain committed to that. And of course, I know I've said it before, but it's so important to us. Our reforms to women's superannuation and superannuation theft, I mean, very, very high priorities for an incoming Labor government.
Right, so we're moving along.
Mr Shorten, every day you say to Australians that everything's going up except their wages. The Grattan report says that the change to the super guarantee could keep wages down by 2%. Are they wrong?
Yeah, the empirical evidence shows that over time, that when there's been an increase in compulsory superannuation, it hasn't affected wages growth. So I'm familiar with what they say, but I don't accept it based on previous evidence. What I would also say about the more general point about wage stagnation in Australia is it's a problem. And I know less a person than the Governor of the Reserve Bank has said it's the #1 issue, low wages growth. No political party serious to form a government can be taken seriously unless they have a wages policy. This government does not have a wages policy other than patting themselves on the back about low wages outcomes. I think the Finance Minister, in one of his less media appearances, said that, you know, this is the low wages is caused by the architecture that they've created in the economy. This goes to the heart of one of the big issues in this election. It is a referendum on wages. Did you know that this Easter, because of the penalty rate cuts, all the people who'll be serving us as we have our holiday time, the total of $80 million reduction in penalty rates. That's what the cost of these arbitrary cuts is. That's $80 million, not just not going to low-paid workers, although that's a disaster, but that's $80 million less that low-paid workers have to spend in the economy. The fact of the matter is that if you earn $40,000 or $50,000, you don't tend to be investing it in your investment properties or your Cayman Islands, or you spend every dollar you get. So when we shrink the volume of money in the economy, when we shrink and cut by $80 million, that's $80 million less that's spent in the economy. Labor has got a plan to get wages going. Now, I know that the government says that wage rises are bad, but they're actually not. The United Kingdom saw an increase in some of its minimum wages, and it saw an increase in employment, not a decrease. What we want to have is modest but meaningful pay rises. We want to work with the independent umpire, the unions, the employers. I get that if a small business is worried about capacity to pay, that is a relevant thing to take into account. But I think ignoring wage stagnation is a disaster for the economy, because after all, as your opening question correctly said, everything's going up in Australia except your wages, and only Labor has a plan to get your wages moving. Jade, I will come to you.
What proportion of the emissions reduction will be required from the electricity sector?
Well, we want to make sure that we're getting all of the sectors contributing to it. We've said that we want to see the electricity or the power generation industry contribute, do its bit to reduce by 45%. And we think you can do that. We believe through the system, and I'm not too proud to say it, we're borrowing from Mr Turnbull and the then Treasurer Mr Morrison's National Energy Guarantee. We think that this is a good system which can actually be made to work, and as we explained to an earlier question, using international offsets, we think it's sensible and considered.
Will be more than 26, which is the government.
So I'm just going to go over here. I promise Dan soon.
On wages, Mr Shorten, now we'll be meeting with some more workers today, but I'd like to find out what you are going to increase their wages beyond your policies of reintroducing penalty rates and cracking down on labour hire. How will you work to increase the wages of people who are not on the minimum wage?
Well, what we'll do is the labour hire crackdown actually does help people above the minimum wage. One of the growing unfairnesses in Australian workplaces is you could be a diesel fitter at Volgren, which is the bus construction company, and you could have someone work alongside you. Well, I won't use Volgren because they might have a different arrangement of labour hire, but in many companies, you've got someone who works directly for the employer, and then they bring in someone else who's got the same trades qualifications, and they work not for the employer, but for a labour hire company who then contracts this person to the in-house company. The problem is then you've got two people working alongside each other, but they're paid different hourly rates. What this does is this dampens wages growth. Because what happens is, if you can employ someone through labour hire cheaper than your direct labour, what you then do is you say to your direct labour, I'd like to give you a pay rise, but I can employ someone else from a labour hire company more cheaply. Another thing that we're going to do to help people above the minimum wage is that we're going to say in enterprise bargaining that at the end of a 3-year enterprise agreement, the employer cannot arbitrarily terminate that agreement and say everyone's back to the award, which could be 50 or 60 or 100% less than what they're getting now, or the employer says, but you don't have to go back to the award, but you do have to accept a significant wages cut. Now, this is not a theory. What we've seen increasingly is right-wing lawyers taking over industrial relations in this country, recommending to companies strategies to terminate agreements, force wages down. There have been hundreds of terminations each year. So these are good practical measures. We'll have more to say about how we're going to help women get wage rises too and better deals, because what we often see in Australia is that an industry which is predominantly feminised, in other words the vast bulk of people are women, what we see there is that on average their pay is less than an industry which is vastly populated by men. But I don't think that when you've got feminised industries the value of that work is actually any less. I think what it reflects is that for too long we've seen a gender unfairness, and that feminised industries, even though their work is important, like early childhood education, gee, that's an important job, because it's feminised, we think it's been disadvantaged. Mr. Shorten. Sorry, Dan.
On Jade's question, sorry. The cut in the electricity sector, will that be more than the 26% cut in that sector that the coalition's promising?
No, our target is to reduce by 45%.
In the electricity sector?
That's our target. Our target is across 45% in the electricity sector, yes.
Can I just confirm that?
Sorry, I got it. Don't know. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Shorten.
Mr. Lee.
I asked to think about yesterday's answer. Can you give final detail on how much the emissions reduction target will impact the economy, what that figure will be? And you talked about offsets. How much money do you expect or believe we need to spend on those international offsets to meet your target?
We will see across the 2020s, as a result of our energy policies and our climate policies, GDP growth of about 23%. In terms of offsets, we will allow companies to purchase offsets if they need to, if they can't meet their carbon emission reductions, by changes in productivity in their workplaces.
I'm not sure that's a financial figure, though, on just how much it's going to cost the economy, because BA Economics says it's going to cost $472 billion over the next 10 years.
I don't
Do you disagree with that? If so, how much is it going to cost?
Yeah, I do disagree with that, and what we have to do is provide you further information about international offsets, but I don't accept that the price of buying international offsets is anywhere in that dimension.
So is there a figure, though, on how much it's going to cost the economy?
Well, I've said that I think, or don't think, but that I know, our economy is going to grow. I don't accept the characterisation that it's a cost. We're going to grow. And we're going to grow because we are going to move to a lower carbon pollution economy. And there's other aspects which means that we will grow. But the modelling's been done. McKibben did his modelling, 45% with international offsets, 26% of government without. But let me...
What if we don't grow? I mean, there's forecasts now that we're facing increasing headwinds domestically and internationally. There's businesses out there which are concerned about facing a recession. What happens if we don't grow over the next 5 years?
Well, first of all, what I would say, what contributes to challenges for the economy is this current government. Like, the economy is more than just climate change. What I would put to you is this. Global debt's rising. And under this government, they have no plan to reduce debt. Now, global debt about 10 years ago, about 130 US trillion. Now it's 230 US trillion around the world. What we've been lucky as a world economy is that interest rates have remained low. But this government has constructed a wafer-thin forecast of a surplus next year by robbing the NDIS, by hiding the cuts they're going to make. What we've done with our economic reforms, and this is the bigger story, is that we've been very upfront. We know that what we need to do in this country is properly fund our schools and hospitals, properly fund our TAFE and our childcare. What we also need to do is give relief to low and middle class taxpayers, and that's what we're doing in our first term. But we also need to improve our financial bottom line as a nation. This government's put together a surplus to get through the next 6 weeks. We all know it's tied together with sticky tape and Band-Aid and heroic projections about wages. If you want to make sure that we secure growth for the future, you vote Labor, because this government's growth plan relies upon low wages and big corporate profits, and it relies upon cutting services. The beauty of our plan for growth is that fairness and decency are good economic guidelines. So if we get wages moving again, tick, economic confidence. If we invest in the physical infrastructure of the nation, as we're doing in Perth with our roads and Metronet, tick. More jobs, more productive infrastructure. If we invest in people, if we're going to give all our 3-year-olds the chance to go to kindergarten as Labor wants to do, international best practice, that means that they, over the long term, are going to get a much better learning process and education. And if I can just finish about how we secure growth, we're going to keep Australians more healthy, because we think that funding health is an important issue. I know that there's some around who say, oh, Labor only wants to talk about health. Well, we want to talk about lots of things. And we have been over the last 6 years as a united team. But I am not going to be deterred or stopped from prioritising healthcare in this election, because a healthy Australia is a productive Australia.
Change of pace.
Sorry.
Change of pace. Can I take you to...
I agree with that comment, Dan.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I take you to George Christensen, and a tip of the hat to Galloway here as well. George Christensen, is it right that he used taxpayer funds for flights connecting to overseas?
No, I don't think so. But Chris has been having a look at this matter. I've been working on some other propositions today, so I'll get him to supplement. But it is a test for Mr Morrison. Is it really right that someone takes 11 weeks off every year to go to the Philippines? They're elected to represent locals, not people in another country.
Thanks, Bill. There's 2 issues here. Has George Christensen been doing his job representing the people of Dawson? I don't see how he can. We're all hard-working members of Parliament, people who want to be members of Parliament. I would say the same of most Liberal and National MPs, despite our differences with them. They want to do the best for their community, and they work hard. You cannot do that, having spent, as I understand it, hundreds of days, 300 days overseas. You just can't do that. You have to be in the community. You have to be talking to ministers. You have to be representing the community. You can't be an effective Member of Parliament with that level of overseas travel. Every Member of Parliament needs a break. Liberal, National, Labor, Greens, everybody needs a break occasionally. Nobody begrudges somebody taking some time off. This is beyond the pale. He's not the member for Dawson, he's the member for Manila South. And I don't care what country he was in. That's irrelevant. He wasn't in Australia. He wasn't in Mackay. He wasn't representing his constituents. On the issue of travel, obviously I don't have access to his travel details, but based on what I've seen and read, he has very, very serious questions to answer about the travel. It's not appropriate to use taxpayer-funded travel to connect to a private overseas flight. It's not appropriate. And it astounds me that Scott Morrison stands by and says it's okay. This is a test of his leadership. It's not just a test of George Christensen, it's a test of Scott Morrison's.
Chris Bowen, can I ask? I know I'm not...
Sorry, no, I don't want to annoy Tim.
You were chewed that long ago.
All right, what's your question, James? If there's no mileage in me being nice to you. No, sorry, I was only joking. Be kind to Tim Day.
Chris Bowen, can I ask you, are you suggesting that the Liberals have scrubbed clean their website of information that would embarrass them, or is the webmaster there just having a bad day?
Well,
what are you saying?
I don't know what their excuse is, but I think they should get their house in order. I mean, Josh Frydenberg, the Treasurer of the country, has got time to take to Twitter last night about the Labor Party's website, which the National Secretary advises us is being updated, and all the policies will be put there, which hasn't been the case in every other election, that all the policies are outlined on the website. As I pointed out to you before, Scott and Josh, congratulations, have got 4 policies on their website. The incumbent government of Australia, 4 policies, well done. And their Liberal plan says the link is dead. Now, I don't know if it's because they're embarrassed by the lack of a plan. They've only got a plan for a scare campaign, that's all they've got. They don't have a plan for the country. Or it's a more reasonable, innocent excuse. Josh can explain the hypocrisy which is at the heart of his political operation. With due respect, it's not my job to describe what's happening with the webmaster of the Liberal Party of Australia, only to point out that the Treasurer is a hypocrite.
But you could release the pages that you've taken off the Labor website, so we could look at them and see whether they've been excluded because of embarrassing mistakes.
No,
you could
absolutely.
do that.
Well, they've been on the website. The National Secretary advises us that some of them were taken down to be updated some time ago. They are being updated. They will be on the website, all our policies. Now, obviously, some of the policies we announced in 2016, this is the 2019 election, those pages need to be updated, and it will happen. I mean, some of the conspiracy theories around, I mean, we announced these policies in 2015 or 2016. I made a major speech a couple of weeks ago announcing the start date of the negative gearing policy and going through the details again and outlining the plans in some detail, including the start date. One thing, you can accuse the Labor Party under Bill's leadership of whatever you want. You can't accuse us of not leading the policy debate and putting detailed policies out there very early for people to examine and to scrutinise. Since 2015, leading to the 2019 election, we've led the policy debate and we're proud of every one of those policies.
Mr. Shorten, can I just confirm with the emissions reduction target that you will release full costings that will answer Jonathan's question before the election?
Oh, fair's fair. I did answer this before. But in terms of our climate policies, we're very clear about our directions. These matters have been modelled, and the debate's not a new debate, is it, Anthony? It's, I was just reminded, as I was listening to the discussion, that the CSIRO and Melbourne University have said that if we don't move to the Paris targets, which is what Labor is saying we should move to, but if we don't move to it, the CSIRO and University of Melbourne says it's going to cost Australian families $14,000 per household. So there's a lot of information out there. You know, this nation needs to move forward on climate change. You know, I said that there's several key issues in this election. One is unity versus disunity. One is referendum on wages. One is who's got the best plan for the health of all Australians. But another one is action on climate change. This is a real debate between the past and the future. And, you know, the issue is this is a government who, you know, if you vote for them on climate change, that's the triumph of hope over experience. I mean, if they were feeding them on climate change, Malcolm Turnbull would still be the leader. Sorry, did you?
Okay, last one, please.
Yeah.
In regards to Labor's wages policy, the Fair Work Commission, which sets the minimum wages, was set up by a Labor government. At the time, Labor, neither Labor or yourself as Minister were complaining about the decisions the Fair Work Commission was making. Can you explain what's actually changed between now and then that we now have a problem in the decisions they're making?
It's called wages stagnation. It's called the deregulation of the labour market through legal tactics. The fact of the matter is that since 2016, Corporate profits gone up on average 39%, wages 5%. I'm going to repeat that because that's a big issue. Under a Liberal government, it's never been a better time to be a top end of town corporate profiteer. There's never been a worse time to be a working Australian. Millions of our fellow Australians have had no wages movement. So what we've seen is the consequences of this government's economic policies, where they've had one plan for most of its life in government, which is to give a tax cut to the big end of town. You know, they did vote 26 times against the Banking Royal Commission. And in the meantime, we've seen penalty rates cut, we've seen the expansion of labour hire, casualisation, we've seen the greater use of the termination of existing wages agreements to coerce people into lower conditions. We've seen revelations of rampant wages theft. We've seen the over-reliance on fixed-term contracts in health and education. I mean, how hard is it being a young person in this country? You do your teacher's qualification and you come out, you say you're doing everything the nation tells you to do, and then you just get a series of rolling short-term contracts for years after years after years. So the problem is that under the Liberals you can't trust them to get wages moving, but we will always consult. We will always make sure that the improvements are modest but meaningful. We'll also take the advice of the economists and we'll listen to industry and business. Thanks everybody, it's been a nice conference. See you all tomorrow, or indeed later today. Thanks.